Let's add one more tool to our knowledge in React. And React 16, which was a new version of React, introduced something called error boundaries. And it solved the problem that React had previously, which was if there was some sort of an error within a component, for whatever reason, there wasn't a graceful way to handle it. On the next render, you'd get all these cryptic errors and things just wouldn't work out nicely. And for a user, you want to make sure that even if a part of your component tree breaks, you can still have a nice UI experience, maybe a piece of text that says something went wrong, but not have the app break. So in this video, we're going to talk about error boundaries and apply it to our RoboFriends app. Let's get started. The first thing I want to do is in the component, I'm going to add a new file, and we'll call this component error boundary. And just as a reminder, you do need React 16 or higher for this to work. So make sure that in your package.json file that you have the right version of React. Now in here, we can do our regular import React component, and we're importing that from the React package. And then finally, we have a class of error boundary that extends the React component. And within here, we have the constructor. And again, we call super here. And just so we have access to the props, we'll have to, within the constructor, have the props parameter. And then finally, for this.state, we're going to create a property called hasError. And for now, it's going to be false. And let's also not forget to export default error boundary so we have access to it. And have our default render here that will return for us. What should it return? Well, ideally, with this error boundary component, we can wrap the component, or we can wrap a component such as the card list component with an error boundary component. And if the card list component fails, we can catch it in the error boundary. I know this is a little bit hard to follow. React does have really good documentation on this, so you can always read up on it later, but stick with me, trust me, it's going to make sense. So the first thing we want to do is we want to check if this.state.hasError is equal to true. So if there is some sort of an error, then we want to return this default state of how can we gracefully display something to the user that makes it meaningful to them, even though we weren't able to display what we intended originally. In our case, we can just say that we have an H1 of, oops, that is not good for the user to see. So we're saying here that if for some reason there's an error, we're going to just spit out an H1 tag. Otherwise, and we could just do a return here, we're going to say that this.props.children will render. Again, remember, because children will be anything that's in between error boundary. In our case, it's probably going to be the card list. So render the children, whatever is inside of error boundary. Otherwise, render H1. Now, how are we going to be able to change this hasError? Well, with React 16, we have a new lifecycle method that was introduced. And it's called component did catch. And this component did catch is kind of like the try catch block in JavaScript. If anything errors out, it'll run this lifecycle hook. And this lifecycle hook actually gets a couple of parameters, that is the error and the info. But in our case, we just want to say that this.setState is going to now, if this component errors out, is going to have has error equal to true. So if that ever gets triggered, we're going to render the h1 tag. All right, let's save. And let's go to app.js. Let's import our error boundaries from our components. And now we can use this, let's use it over here for the card list. So if something goes on with the card list, we want to have some sort of a graceful exit, a boundary. So we'll say error boundary. And because we're rendering this.props.children, if we wrap it like this and nothing goes on, it'll still render card list. So let's save. Let's see if we made any mistakes. So far, so good. Let's go back to our app. And all right, let's look at the console. No errors here. If we refresh, no errors here. If I type stuff, no errors. That's good. Now, with this error boundary, if anything in the card list fails, it's going to catch it and display our error message. So let's see what I mean. If I go into card list here, and now in here, if we say if, for now, we'll just say true, we're going to assume that card list there was an error. So we can do that by saying throw new error. We'll say no. If we save this, everything is still working. If I go back, you see that I'm still getting the error. It says onCut error, no. And at the bottom, it says the above error occurred in the card list component. React will try to recreate this component tree from scratch using the error boundary you provided, error boundary. Okay, that's great, but I still see the error. And that is because we're running right now in development mode. For Create React App, they want to show us whenever there's an error in our component. Error boundaries are really useful when you put your apps into production, where you don't have this detailed logs of what errors you have. Your users are never going to see this. So if I refresh here really fast, did you see that right over here, how it said, oops, that is not good. Oops, that is not good. So in production, users are going to see that. But for our case, the intended behavior for Create React App in development is to show us the errors. But with error boundaries, we have that extra safety during production. That's it for now. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.